The Zelda Timeline shares a lot in common with what sucks, and the fact that it sucks and it's no fun for anyone. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the lore of this series. The stories are super fun, and the idea that the games are connected in the same universe in some chronological order is awesome. The problem is that this thing is really bad and convoluted and not even a timeline sometimes. Like, what even is the Fallen Hero timeline? So you're telling me all of these games happen because Link dies in Ocarina of Time before he can defeat Ganondorf? Two things. First of all, that's not a timeline. Timelines are created because of time travel. This is an alternate reality, which is just another dimension that's created because of a different decision that someone makes, which would make the entirety of the Fallen Hero timeline hypothetical. And second, that's just dumb as heck. Link dies and that creates an alternate reality. This guy who's currently doing something crazy behind me on this green screen, yeah, that's just silly and I refuse to accept that. But the problems don't end there. Let's talk about the end of the timeline, because apparently all three timelines merge into one timeline, which then ushers in the new era of The Legend of Zelda. The explanations I've heard to rationalize this range from pretty neat to just insane. But whatever the justification, this decision was just silly and a cop-out. For the past few years, every time that I've looked at this travesty of a timeline, I've always thought, I can do better than that. That's it. I'm gonna do better than that. All right, gamers, let's start with a few ground rules. The things I'm trying to fix here are the Fallen Hero timeline and the merger at the end of the timeline. So all of that kind of shenaniganry is just out of the question. Additionally, any new timelines must be the direct result of time travel. I will also be doing my best to make sure that the existence of Ganondorf makes sense and is consistent throughout the timeline. This is going to be a big influence on where I place games in this new timeline. With that out of the way, the first game in my new Zelda timeline will be Skyward Sword. As a shocker, right? It turns out the game specifically designed to be the first game in the series, and the origin point of everything ends up being the first game in the timeline. What's really interesting is what games come after Skyward Sword, so make sure you stick around to see what I do with the Fallen Hero timeline. The next game after Skyward Sword is going to be Breath of the Wild. But wait, before you run to the comments and scream at me, let me explain. You see, Breath of the Wild has more in common with Skyward Sword than any other game in the series. For example, Breath of the Wild is the only Zelda game aside from Skyward Sword where Zelda goes to the Sacred Spring to unlock her sacred sealing power. Additionally, Breath of the Wild is the only other game that has the sacred ceremony involving Princess Zelda and the Master Sword. This moment right here in Breath of the Wild is a direct callback to this moment in Skyward Sword. While I'm on this, obviously Tears of the Kingdom is going to come directly after Breath of the Wild. In this game, Rauru just straight up tells us that he's the first king of Hyrule. Normally, we have to jump through a lot of hoops to explain this away in the current timeline, but what if he's just telling the truth? What if he really is the first king of Hyrule? Let's be polite and just believe this guy. By believing him, we eliminate a lot of mental gymnastics that we have to do to try and make up for his canonical placement in the timeline. I'll also point out that these are the only games in the series where we see the Master Sword sustain any kind of damage, period. We see it in Breath of the Wild with the wear and tear on the Master Sword after the Calamity, and we see it in Tears of the Kingdom when Ganon attacks it with spaghetti. The reason for this is literally the newest version of the Master Sword before it's bathed in sacred light for 10,000 years. It makes sense that it's going to be a little less powerful. This is also one of the only games where we see Fi interact with us at all. She's just kind of gone in the other ones. Those are my strongest points of evidence supporting that this game takes place early in the timeline, but what about the copious amounts of evidence supporting that it's at the end of the timeline? What about the divine beasts that are just blatantly named after the sages in Ocarina of Time? Well, to that, all I have to say is that naming things doesn't only go in one direction, meaning that the divine beasts are most likely named after the sages that we see in Tears of the Kingdom. You know, the ones that wear helmets that are direct references to the divine beasts. In the game files, some of these sages are actually named. For example, the Zora sage is just straight up called Ruto. Then in Ocarina of Time, these new sages are just named after the divine beasts or the previous sages from Tears of the Kingdom, or the names just work their way into the culture of all of the respective races. Okay, well, what about the existence of the Koroks and Rito in Breath of the Wild? It's completely possible that the Koroks are first introduced in Breath of the Wild and reintroduced in Wind Waker way later in the timeline. We'll talk more about that game when we get there. But what I'm saying is that the children of the Great Deku Tree change greatly throughout the games, and I think it's logical to conclude that they could look like Koroks in Breath of the Wild. For the Rito, I'm just not convinced that the Rito in Breath of the Wild and the Rito in Wind Waker are the same race. I personally think that they're just completely different species, and they're just called Rito Gerudo because the Hylians see bird people and just assume Rito. The Rito in Wind Waker are descended from Zoras, whereas the Rito in Breath of the Wild could be a completely unique species. We even see a reference of bird people in the Ocarina of Time manga, which admittedly isn't canon, but it's evidence that the idea of them existing before Wind Waker is out there. With all that cleared up and with absolutely no other questions about the timeline, let's move on to the next game in the timeline, which is going to be Ocarina of Time. In this game, we open on a Hyrule that's been ravaged by a civil war. But what caused that civil war? Personally, I think it was the rediscovery of the Triforce. I always thought that it was very strange that we went through the entirety of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom without a single reference to the Triforce. And I think the simplest explanation for that is no one remembered the Triforce. No one had really learned about it before because it was buried in deep, deep history and only used in Skyward Sword. It makes sense that the eventual discovery of the Triforce would result in a civil war. And this war ended with the Triforce being locked behind the Master Sword, which is locked behind the Door of Time, which requires 3 spiritual stones to open, and it's in the Temple of Time guarded by the royal family. It's pretty good security, especially considering that literally no evil can touch the Master Sword. It would take a very specific set of events for anyone to even access the Triforce who the royal family didn't want to, and that will definitely never happen ever, especially by this thief from the desert named Ganondorf. Speaking of Ganondorf, didn't we kill him in the last game? I'm so glad you asked, because yes we did. This Ganondorf is a completely new Ganondorf. But do you know who I don't think is a new person? Twinrova. In this specific cutscene in Tears of the Kingdom, we see these 2 twin witches standing behind Ganondorf. If you translate the text on their weapons into English, you get the names of these 2 twin witches, which I have never pronounced correctly in my life because I'm a big dumb idiot. The names are the same as these 2 witches from Ocarina of Time. So here's my theory. After the death of the first Ganondorf, these 2 witches seal themselves away in order to wait for the next Gerudo. But the problem is, Ganondorf didn't die at first, he was simply sealed away, which meant that a new male Gerudo couldn't be born. Therefore, these witches ended up being sealed away for a long time until Ganondorf was actually killed and another male Gerudo could be born. Then the 2 witches find this new male Gerudo, raise him up as the new Ganondorf, and then he haunts the rest of this timeline. After that, the game takes place the exact same way as it did in the canon timeline. We seal away Ganondorf at the end of the game, and Link is sent back to relive his childhood. And then this, of course, results in the infamous timeline split. This is unfortunately completely unavoidable because the Ganondorf in Wind Waker and the Ganondorf in Twilight Princess are the exact same person, and he dies in both of them. This leaves us with the child timeline with Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess, and the adult timeline with Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, and Spirit Tracks. And that's it. That's the end of the timeline. Or at least this part of the timeline, because if we head all the way back to Skyward Sword, may I remind you that we pulled some wild timeline shenaniganry. At the end of the game, we use the Triforce to defeat Demise. That's it, he's gonzo. But Girahim comes to thwart our plans. Girahim goes back in time to revive Demise before we're able to use the Triforce to defeat him. This of course ends with Link beating the ever-living crap out of Demise, but it doesn't protect the timeline from splitting. You see, the timeline that we just went over was the timeline where Demise is destroyed using the Triforce. But there's a new timeline created at the end of Skyward Sword because we never needed to use the Triforce to destroy Demise because he's already sealed inside the Master Sword. This leads to some very interesting side effects that we'll discuss in the first game of this new timeline, Minish Cap. At the beginning of this game, we learn about a hero that rose up to defeat demons. This hero receives a sacred sword from the Picori who descended from the sky. Let's think for a second. What other sacred sword do we know of that resides in the skies of Hyrule? That's right, I'm claiming that the Picori sword and the Goddess sword are the same exact sword. In Skyward Sword, Link draws the Goddess Sword and turns it into the Master Sword using several sacred flames. Then he uses the Triforce to destroy Demise. But then he travels back in time with the Master Sword, destroys Demise, seals him inside that Master Sword, and then heads back to his timeline. The Master Sword is not in this current timeline that we are talking about, but the Goddess Sword still is because Link has yet to draw it because they went back in time before Link had even pulled out the Goddess Sword. The theory is that the sword that the Picori end up giving Link is the Goddess Sword from the Goddess statue up in Skyloft. Then, during the events of Minish Cap, we end up turning the Picori blade or the Goddess Sword into the Four Sword very similarly to how we turned the Goddess Sword into the Master Sword using Sacred Flames. The difference is we use 4 elements instead, which cause a creation of a slightly different sword from the Master Sword. Then we use this new sword, the 4 Sword, to destroy Vadi. Then the seal breaks on Vadi, resulting in the next theme in the timeline, 4 Swords. In 4 Swords, we just seal away Vadi again. It's pretty simple. But in 4 Swords Adventure, which comes immediately after 4 Swords, we're introduced to a new villain. A male Gerudo by the name Ganondorf Dragmire enters the Desert Pyramid to retrieve a magical trident, which then turns him into the monster Ganon that we all know and love. He also manages to steal the Dark Mirror, which contains a dark realm inside of it, which is similar to the Dark World. That leads us to the next game where Ganon is revived because of Demise's eternal butthurt. And then Ganon and the rest of Hyrule learn about the Triforce, which turns into a war, which eventually ends with Ganon being sealed in the Sacred Realm, which he then turns into the Dark World. This leads us to the next game, A Link to the Past. In this game, Ganon is the new threat, and Link has to rise up and pull out the Master Sword. And may I point out that the official artwork of the Master Sword in A Link to the Past looks a lot more similar to the 4 Sword than it does to what we traditionally think of when we think of the Master Sword. During this game, we imbue the Master Sword with additional magic with the help of a Master Smith and a Great Fairy. Then, after we defeat Ganon, we head to the next set of games, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. And finally, we get to Link's Awakening. All of these games are then followed by A Link Between Worlds, where we get to see the Master Sword in a much familiar form after its appearance has been altered using magic and smithing. Then, after that, we have Triforce Heroes, I guess, but it takes place in a completely different kingdom, so I'm just gonna go ahead and ignore this one. Which brings us to the very end of this timeline with Zelda 1 and Zelda 2. And that's it. That's the timeline. That's every single one of these games put into a connected universe with absolutely no flaws whatsoever. We also managed to eliminate an entire alternate reality, and we also got rid of the stupid timeline merging shenanigans. So, may I present my new and improved timeline. The series starts with a war against Demise where Hylia seals him away, and she puts the humans on Skyloft. Then the goddess Hylia sheds her divinity to become the very first Zelda. Years later, we have the events of Skyward Sword. Link creates the Master Sword, and Zelda discovers that she's the goddess Hylia. This allows her to imbue the Master Sword with sacred magic, creating the true Master Sword. Then Link is able to find and use the Triforce in order to destroy Demise. Then Girahim takes Zelda back in time, which then forces Link to 1v1 no items final destination Demise to death. This creates 2 timelines, one where Link used the Triforce to destroy Demise, and one where Link killed a man. We will call these 2 timelines the Wish Timeline and the Murder Timeline. Link then travels back to the Wish Timeline where the Triforce was used to destroy Demise, and they start a new civilization which eventually becomes Hyrule. Eventually the Zonai appear and they help create this new kingdom, Hyrule, and Rauru is made the first king of Hyrule out of respect for the Zonai. Then Ganondorf appears from the desert, and he tries to live up to the stories of the old Demon King by possessing a secret stone from Rauru. This leads to the events we see depicted in the past of Tears of the Kingdom. This eventually ends with Ganondorf being sealed away by Rauru and Hyrule Castle being built on top of them to help improve the seal. Then for thousands of years, the kingdom is haunted by calamities which are caused by Ganondorf's malice leaking out from under Rauru's seal. These calamities build up over time until eventually in Breath of the Wild, one completely destroys the kingdom. This then leads to the events of Breath of the Wild. Link is able to defeat the calamity and bring some amount of peace to the kingdom of Hyrule, but then Link and Zelda find Ganondorf sealed under Hyrule Castle. This then leads to the events of Tears of the Kingdom. Eventually Link kills Ganondorf, and this leads to another era of peace in Hyrule. After some time of peace though, the legends of the Triforce begin to sneak forward once again, and people start looking for the Triforce again. Once they discover where the Triforce is and how to get to it, this results in a huge civil war, which eventually ends with the Triforce being sealed behind the Master Sword, which is behind the Door of Time in the Temple of Time. Additionally, the witches known as Twinrova are able to find a new male Gerudo and begin to raise the new Ganondorf. Then the events of Ocarina of Time take place. Ganondorf is able to access the Sacred Realm through some top-tier manipulation, and Link is forced to fight him at the end of the game and eventually seals him away. Then the game ends with Link being sent back in time to relive his childhood. This results in a timeline split with the child timeline and the adult timeline. The adult timeline follows the events of Hyrule after Link is removed from the timeline. Then the child timeline follows the hero of time on his adventures. In the adult timeline, we learn that Link is gonzo, which means that when the seal breaks on Ganondorf, he is completely uninterrupted in his quest to destroy everything. Eventually, the people of Hyrule decide to pray to the gods, who flood the entire Earth in order to save them, which still doesn't kill Ganondorf and leads to the events of Wind Waker, where Link has to go and kill Ganondorf himself. At the very end, Ganondorf is killed, and the king is able to use the Triforce in order to erase Hyrule altogether. No more Hyrule. Frick you, Hyrule. Then that game is followed up by the events of Phantom Hourglass, where Link goes into the realm of the Ocean King and destroys the demon Bella. After that, some time passes and the new kingdom of Hyrule is established. A new Link and Zelda arrive, and they're forced to kill a new demon called Maladus, which then ends the adult timeline. Then we make our way over to the child timeline, which goes over to Majora's Mask, which follows Link's adventures in Termina. But then we have Twilight Princess, where we find out that Ganondorf was prevented from ever getting the Triforce, and we see his failed execution and him being banished into the Twilight Realm. Ganondorf then manipulates Zant into doing his bidding, which brings us to the events of Twilight Princess, where at the very end of the game, Link is successfully able to defeat Ganondorf, and with just a little bit of help from Zant from the grave, they are able to kill Ganondorf once and for all, bringing an end to the child timeline. Now we'll head all the way back to the events of Skyward Sword, and we'll take a look at the murder timeline. The events of this timeline are kicked off by Link brutally murdering Demise and leaving. This creates a new timeline where there was never any reason to create the Master Sword or use the Triforce in the first place, but it was still safe enough for people to return to the surface. Some people chose to stay in the sky, but many people chose to go to the surface. But once they arrived there, they learned that there were still freaking monsters everywhere. That's not funny. I don't know why I'm laughing. This leads to a new hero arising, known simply as the Hero of Men. Then the Picori descend from the sky. What they were doing in the sky is beyond me, but they bring with them the Goddess Sword. Then Link uses the Goddess Sword to seal all of the monsters into a Pandora's box of sorts. Vaati breaks the Goddess Sword and releases all of the monsters from the Pandora's box. Link has to reforge the Goddess Sword using the Elemental Sanctuary, which then creates the Four Sword. Link then uses the Four Sword to seal away Vaati. Then the seal breaks and a new Link has to come and pull the sword out again and just do the whole thing over again. And then the seal breaks again and another Link has to come and do it again. Like, come on guys, let's figure something out. But there's also a new enemy in this new game, Ganondorf Dragmire, who goes into a desert pyramid, gets a trident, becomes Ganon, and becomes the new enemy of the series. And Link is able to seal him away using the Four Sword. But we both know how good those seals work. Eventually the seal breaks, Ganon comes back, but this time he learns about the Triforce, which results in a huge war and eventually him being sealed into the Sacred Realm, which then creates the Dark World, and Link has to go and get the Master Sword from the woods, which is just a new name for the Four Sword. But because of time and the seals breaking, a lot of the magic from the Four Sword is gone, and Link has to imbue it with new magic with help from a Master Smith and a Great Fairy. Then Link is able to kill Ganondorf at the end of the game and gain possession of the Triforce. The Triforce, in return, sends him to frickin' Holodrum. Link then goes through the entire adventure of Holodrum. Ganon is revived by Twin Rova, and Link kills him again. Then, on his way back from Holodrum, his ship just crashes, and this results in Link's awakening, which, spoiler alert, is all a dream. After that, we have a Link Between Worlds, where there's a completely new villain, Yuga, a magician causing all kinds of trouble. Link, which is a new Link, by the way, is able to go into the woods and get the new Master Sword, which is taken on the form of the Master Sword that we're most familiar with because of the new magic that's inside of it. And he uses it to defeat Yuga and eventually save a completely different world by using the Triforce at the end of the game to make a new Triforce at the end of the game. After that, he goes to a cosplaying convention. Many years after the cosplaying convention, a completely new threat ravages the kingdom: politics. For some reason, there's a prince who's really mad at a princess, and due to a series of unfortunate events, this princess is cursed and she ends up being in an eternal sleep. She gets locked away in some palace, not to be heard from ever again. Or is she? Then we have the events of Zelda 1, where Ganon is revived again, but thankfully he is killed for the last time in this entire freaking timeline, and we never see this guy again. He tries to get his hands on the Triforce, doesn't work. Only gets his hands on the Triforce of Power. Link kills him. Then Link has the Triforce of Power and the Triforce of Wisdom, and he saves Zelda. Then he learns about a Zelda who was put into an eternal sleep, and he has to go save her too, because that's what heroes do. And so he goes on a quest to find the Triforce of Courage so he can use the full might of the Triforce to awaken this Zelda from her cursed sleep. And that's it. That's the very end of the timeline. We were able to fix some of the biggest plot holes in the series, and sometimes we just made up new lore. I'll be expecting my check from Nintendo any day now. Thank you.